might have referenced the fact that we had previously seen um, the use of sort of live comms online with the Al Shabaab Kenya Mall attack in 2013. But what was really different about the Christchurch incident was the virality of the content. So there was a 17-minute live stream. There were 4,000 live views, but in the first 24 hours, YouTube was experiencing uploads of copies of the video at a rate of 1 per second. Facebook took down 1.5 million copies of it in the first 24 hours. The platforms saw 800 distinct versions of that video in the first week. So, slightly modified versions, whether by length or with filters or other modifications. And they really struggled to get on top of it and get that content down. So what that exposed was both vulnerabilities in the technology of these platforms around live stream and their ability to work together, and around lack of communication and coordination mechanisms with the governments. So in thinking about how to respond to this this awful event, um, the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, had a number of options that she could have reached for. Um, Quite often in circumstances like this, there's a sort of reflexive move to a harsh regulatory response. But I think she recognised that an effective response was not within the gift of a government working alone, or within the gift of industry working alone. The New Zealand response to this was also very much guided by the history of multi-stakeholder engagement in internet governance issues. And so right from the very beginning, there was a recognition that the response was going to have to be one that went across governments and industry and civil society, researchers, community groups. So we worked very closely with the French government. The president of France is still the co-chair of the call, and together New Zealand and France negotiated the text of the call with a small group of governments and tech companies. And it was launched in May 2019 in Paris with an initial set of 17 government supporters and 8 online service providers. So in terms of what the call actually is, I'd encourage you to take a look. If you go to christchurchcall.com, you can see the text. It's 24 commitments for online service providers and governments. Some of them are just for the platforms, some of them are just for governments, and some of them are shared commitments. Taken together, they're about working together and with civil society and academia in a multi-stakeholder way to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. There's a real focus on both prevention and response. So for governments, for example, there's a commitment to address the real world drivers of radicalization. And that's an area where the research that is done by academics and frontline practitioners is really key to the work that we do. And underpinning the whole call is a commitment that any actions we take will be done in a way that respects human rights and a free, open, secure internet. So one of the interesting things I think about the call that sets it apart slightly from maybe other international initiatives is that it's very much a leader-led initiative. So the President of France and the New Zealand Prime Minister are the co-chairs, and they periodically convene heads of state, heads of government with tech leaders and with the heads of civil society organizations, universities and the like, to talk about the issues, identify the priorities for the call, and to agree on the way forward. So that really sets the direction um, for all of the call supporters for the work that we're going to do together. So the first key meeting after the launch was in September 2019. Bunch of new governments came on board at that point, and a key thing that happened at that time was the reform and relaunch of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. Um, it was reformed, relaunched as an independent NGO with a permanent staff, and the purpose of that was very much for the 4 founding companies of the GIFCT, who are all core supporters as well, to create a mechanism for the delivery of their call commitments. Another thing that happened at that time was the launch of crisis response protocols. And so Erin Saltman probably talked to you a little bit about the GIFCT's own incident response framework. The core community also has a crisis response protocol, and further on in this talk, I'll go into a little bit more detail about the crisis or incident response work. There was another summit in May 2021 where quite detailed work plans were developed for priority areas of work, for example, around algorithms and how they drive user journeys, user experiences, and what the impact might be on radicalization. And then once we have that understanding, coming up with positive interventions. Another area is transparency around both tech company and government's work to counter terrorist and violent extremist content online. And then most recently, leaders met again in September last year to take stock of progress and identify some new priorities for action. So today in the core community, there's more than 50 governments, the EU, intergovernmental organisations like UNESCO. We have 14 online service providers, work very closely with the GIFCT and with Tech Against Terrorism as partners. And we have an active civil society advisory network of more than 50 organisations and individuals. Thought it might be useful just to take a bit of a dive into the area that I work most on, which is incident response. So within the text of the call, there's a shared commitment for governments and tech companies to work together to develop processes allowing us to respond rapidly, effectively, and in a coordinated manner to an event like the Christchurch terror attack. There are also commitments there for online service providers to address the inherent risks around live stream, make sure that that's a safe product service that they're offering to their users, to cooperate with law enforcement in the aftermath of an attack to take content down, but make sure that it's preserved for law enforcement purposes and for any investigations or judicial proceedings that might be forthcoming. And then there's a commitment for governments to encourage ethical reporting by mainstream media, very much while still respecting freedom of the press. So in this space, the early focus very much was on getting the GIFCT stood up and on developing that suite of crisis response protocols. The EU also has a crisis response protocol that works together with the Christchurch Call one and the GIFCT's incident response framework. And there's some domestic protocols that sit underneath. Australia has one, New Zealand has one, the UK has one, and has had since 2017. And those are to enable good coordination across government and in relation to industry in one of these kind of events. And what we've been doing since 2019 is really working on testing and refining and updating those protocols, and really using tabletop exercises and the like to strengthen the way we're able to coordinate with each other in an event of wherever it may happen, and whatever the nature of it may be. So if we think about the impact of our work to date, um, we can really see that the Christchurch Call is making a big difference, particularly in the area of crisis response. The first thing to note is, I guess, that um, the protocols are very rarely activated, except in really exceptional circumstances. So I think the GIFCT has activated its protocol maybe a handful of times since it was first developed in 2019. The EU protocol's been activated once. And this is quite an important point, because I think when we were first developing these protocols, there was concern in civil society, especially, that they were going to enable sort of frequent, large-scale takedowns of content coordinated across governments and industry. But it hasn't worked out that way, and they really are only used in exceptional circumstances. We saw after Christchurch an attempt at live streaming in the Halle, Germany attack of October 2019. And there, that was an attack that was live streamed on Twitch. It was a 35-minute long live stream. There were only a handful of live views, but there were 2,500 views of an automatically generated copy of the live stream, and that those auto-generated copies stayed up for on the Twitch platform for 6 hours. So that was quite a slow response. And although it didn't get a lot of media attention, that online content has a reasonably large digital footprint still today. Fast forward to May last year, when we had the attack in Buffalo, New York. Now, the Buffalo attacker was a lot savvier in his choices, and had planned a lot more thoroughly than the Halle attacker. And hence, this was a much more significant test of our incident response work and the protocols and systems that we have developed together. So Twitch had done quite a lot of work on sort of multi-layered safety improvements to their live stream offerings, and they were able to get that live stream down within 2 minutes. There were only 22 live views. The GIFCT activated its content incident protocol within 2 hours. Here in New Zealand, we were able to use legislative powers that had been created after Christchurch to call in the Buffalo Terrorists Manifesto and make an interim classification that content was objectionable here in New Zealand, which means it's illegal to have it, share it, distribute it. And that's important because Tech Against Terrorism uses the classifications made by the New Zealand Classification Office as a bar for it to then put content into its terrorist content analytics platform, so that it can alert all its registered companies if they find that content on their services. And the bar for finding content in New Zealand to be objectionable is very high. and it's subject to due process and judicial review and appeals. And so that gives Tech Against Terrorism the confidence that it's a rights respecting assessment of the content that and it can safely include that material in the terrorist contents analytics platform. So in terms of where we're headed to now, the work under the 4 work plans continues. So we're continue to try and build the Christchurch Call community, strengthen the advisory network, and increase the geographical and geographical diversity and diversity of perspectives that people in the advisory network can bring to our work. We're also continuing to make progress on transparency work. So we're about to do a series on government transparency and what good looks like in that space, and in terms of how governments interact with platforms to influence or dictate what kind of content can stay up or down or come down. And this is a subject that's of great interest in the US at the moment. Of course, there's great suspicion that governments may be covertly influencing or introducing bias into the tech platform's own implementation of their terms of service. So, you know, this work is timely. There are guidelines that exist for governments around what good transparency looks like, including the Santa Clara Principles, and also Tech Against Terrorism's developed some guidelines for government transparency, specifically around content moderation for terrorist and violent extremist content. So we'll be looking at those, thinking about the gaps and trying to encourage our government supporters to improve their transparency around their interactions with platforms in this space. We've also got quite a lot of work to do on strengthening incident response. One of the things that we learned from Buffalo is that while we were able to ensure through our work that the attacker's content was a lot less prevalent on the mainstream platforms, and in particular on the platforms of members of the GIF-CT, it was still prevalent on smaller platforms and in what you might think of as the sort of alt tech service providers, the ones that resist any kind of moderation or may even see it as their point of difference. So, for example, the Buffalo video, while Twitch was able to get it down within 2 minutes of the shooting actually starting, a copy of that ended up on a very small platform where there were no staff available over the weekend to take any action against it. So that copy was up for quite a period and attracted more than 2 million views before it was taken down. That was not the intention of that small platform. It was simply a capacity resourcing issue and quite devastating for them. We've also seen, obviously, that some of those more alt tech kind of platforms do play a role day to day in acting as repositories and stores for this information and this kind of content, but they also play a pretty significant role during an incident where people who are sympathetic with the attacker's cause use these kind of platforms to share, repurpose, proliferate the content, and then resurface it back onto mainstream platforms. So one of the things that we will be doing in the call context is thinking about what good human rights respecting responses might look like for governments and for different online service providers at different layers of the internet stack to take during an incident or against those sort of old tech service providers if they refuse to take action against really, really graphic, egregious, violent extremist content. And it's fair to say that within our advisory network, we will have some very different views of what appropriate actions might look like by governments or by service providers. We know that civil society, for example, there's been strong calls for Cloudflare, for example, to take action against these kinds of providers, either by denying web hosting or denying protection to these kinds of sites. Some governments also have the ability to block or to do web filtering in specific instances. The Australian e-safety commissioner has that power, for example, and can exercise it in an incident of this sort. So what we'll be doing in the core community is really working through what are the options, when is it appropriate to use one option or another, and how do we make sure that what we're doing is necessary, targeted, proportionate, and not having an undue negative impact on the free, open, secure internet that we all benefit from. We've also got further work underway on studying algorithmic impacts. We have a very exciting project underway with a not-for-profit called Open Mind, and with Twitter initially, looking at algorithmic outcomes and how we might use privacy-enhancing technologies to enable researchers to independently and remotely study how algorithms are operating on platforms and the kinds of outcomes they're driving. So that's pretty groundbreaking research. We're sort of working through various layers of proof of concept, and that will be pretty exciting if that leads where we hope it will. Then we have some work also really looking at different dimensions of the terrorist, violent, extremist landscape. So youth, gender-based hate and violence, and also against LGBTQI communities. So there, what we're looking to do is make sure that we have the right perspectives, the different voices represented in our community and in our advisory network. So that's about building out the diversity there. We want to really draw on research to understand the links between hate against women, violent misogyny, hate against transgender people, for example, and violent extremism, and then design appropriate interventions to address that. And in this work, we're obviously partnering with others. There are different initiatives that look specifically at youth or specifically at gender-based online harassment and hate. And we're very much looking to partner with those rather than duplicate. The final area of work that's underway is looking at future technologies, emerging technologies, and the risks that they might pose in terms of terrorist and violent extremist content online, and how we can address those in a sort of proactive way. So when I think about you and how you, as students, as researchers, as lecturers, may be able to help in terms of the Christchurch Call and the kinds of outcomes we're seeking. The first thing is very much for each of us as individual users to ensure that our own online behaviour is responsible, and to encourage our friends loved ones, acquaintances to also have responsible online behaviours. So, for example, after an event, not sharing video footage that are, because after Christchurch, a lot of the shares of the video were in fact by people saying who were horrified by what they were seeing, but in effect, sharing it in hate is still propagating the terrorists' message and can be very harmful. So yeah, don't share. Obviously, for all of this work, we need really good, solid research base, knowledge base for designing effective, safe interventions that respect human rights. And so, I mean, that is the role of academics and researchers, and it's highly skilled work. So I encourage you to continue building your skills and expertise in this area and contributing to this important work. You also might want to join the Christchurch Call advisory network. So I know that Swansea University's Cyber Threats Research Centre is part of the Christchurch Call network. Dr. Katie Vaughan is the co-chair of the advisory network. The Global Youth Forum, which I understand to be a sort of coalition of student associations, is now part of the advisory network. And so, if you have an interest in this area, you have skills to bring, I'd encourage you by all means to get involved. So that's about it from me. Sorry, a bit shorter, but are there any questions?
Thanks, Kristina. Thanks for an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed the way you kind of crossed the both the political and the operational sides of it. So, no, fascinating topic and a great initiative. We've got a couple of questions in there, but I'd just like to kick off perhaps with a hard question for you. I guess one of the criticisms of many initiatives in the digital environment is that they're toothless tigers, in the sense that participation by social media companies is voluntary. I guess we see that with things like the new EU Digital Safety Act, the US Raise the Bar Act, and even the initiative that you mentioned that the Christchurch Call is working on, the algorithm outcomes with Twitter. And I note that Facebook and Google have chosen not to participate in this. I think the question really is that, given big tech's often empty promises on addressing online hate and violence, I'd be really interested in your thoughts, or the call's thoughts, or both, on less voluntary participation by social media companies and the need for greater regulation.
Yeah, it's a hard question. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. In fact, one of the commitments in the call for government supporters is to take necessary steps, including regulatory policy and the like, to address terrorist and violent extremist content. What we would want to see in the call context is for those to be very carefully developed, with thorough multi-stakeholder engagement. I know that many in our call community have been very actively involved, for example, in commenting on the Digital Services Act, and getting that to its final kind of shape and form. So I think, we've achieved a lot through the kind of voluntary cooperative mechanisms, and that will continue. We're looking obviously to expand the coalition of the willing, and to reach as many small, large companies through the GIFCT, through Tech Against Terrorism as we can, but there are some that either won't or can't work with us. And for them, regulation is one of the options that I guess we would be looking at. You mentioned the Christchurch Call algorithmic outcomes initiative, and the fact that Facebook isn't participating, for example. The purpose of the research that's being done at the moment is to trial some particular technologies on particular data sets to give proof of concept that this can be done in a way that doesn't infringe on the privacy of users' information or on the proprietary information of the platforms concerned. And we're taking that in a very methodical, stepwise kind of fashion, but our hope is to be transparent and to build everyone's confidence around this technology as we go forward. So we didn't need everyone on board at the start, and I think that you know, if it continues to succeed at the successive stages, then we will build that confidence and bring people on board. And I think that it's not either or with a regulatory approach. It may be that the technologies that we're trialing here are very important in allowing the kinds of researcher access that are envisaged in the Digital Services Act.
No, great.
Does that answer?
Yeah,
Sorry?
absolutely. In fact, it answered my question and part of one of the other questions that was asked as well, Kristina. Sean asked a question about the algorithmic transparency impact work. There is a second part to Sean's question, from Sean from the UK, his question. And he asked, do you foresee any issues given Twitter's current state? And I guess we're all interested in the new chief Twit and how that's going to impact the Christchurch Call.
So Twitter remains a partner, a supporter of the Christchurch Call, and we continue to work with them very closely in the algorithmic outcomes work. Obviously, everyone's got eyes on the kinds of content on the platform, what may or may not be changing in terms of their content moderation practices. And it's an ongoing conversation in the community and with Twitter, but they are still very much a partner working collaboratively with us on that particular project. And it remains a priority for them.
Okay, no, that's great news. Good to hear. Thank you for that. I guess in line with that, there's a question here that asks where the line is between unobjectionable and objectionable material, and how we can ensure any ambiguity here doesn't hamper freedom of expression.
Yeah, really good question. So in New Zealand, objectionable has a certain meaning that is set out in legislation. It's broader than terrorist and violent extremist content. It covers child sexual exploitation material, for example, and other forms of violent sexual content. And the bar is very high for that. And the classifications are made by the chief censor, strange title, but that's another story. And as I said, they're subject to due process review. People can lodge complaints, have things re-looked at again. When content is found objectionable in New Zealand and it's available on a platform to New Zealanders, then our Department of Internal Affairs can issue a takedown notice to a platform and ask them to remove it. They will often do that because it breaches their own terms of service. The terms of service of companies tend to be much stricter than the legal standards for objectionable content. And so you will find that the companies are voluntarily taking down a lot more content than is strictly required by our law, for example, in New Zealand. I guess the tricky thing is when governments start to influence the decisions about what is or isn't within a company's terms of service. And we saw this recently with the Facebook Oversight Board decision on the UK drill music case. I don't know whether people are familiar with that one, but basically the Oversight Boards, the UK Metropolitan Police were referring these drill music videos to Facebook and asking them to take them down. Facebook was routinely taking them down. The Oversight Board found upon review that they shouldn't have, and that their decisions had been biased by the kind of channel through which the content referrals were coming, and the fact that it was coming from the UK police. So we do have to be very, very careful, and part of the answer, I guess, is for governments to improve their transparency around how they're interacting with the platforms. Does that answer the question?
I think it does, and there's perhaps a follow-up, another question here that kind of links into what you're talking about. And this is one of the questions from Australia. The question is, are you concerned about mainstream media channels replaying video footage of violent extremist attacks in the name of public interest? And the question is really around whether you engage with media groups to inform industry standards.
Yes. Yes, we're concerned, and yes, we do engage. So in the call text, there is a commitment for governments to encourage ethical reporting and to work with mainstream media on the development of standards or the like for that. So UNESCO has a handbook for journalists and responsible coverage of terrorist events, which goes into a lot of detail around the kinds of considerations that journalists and mainstream media organizations should bring to considering whether they should, run with a particular piece of content or not, particularly where it's been produced by a perpetrator, a terrorist themselves. In New Zealand, police have a protocol for coverage of these kinds of events that they have worked on with the Media Freedom Council, and which our mainstream media organisations largely follow. There are instances where we may not agree with the decisions that have been made, but that can always be a conversation through the Media Freedom Council, and that is the appropriate way for it to proceed, because obviously freedom of press, freedom of information is another key kind of human right that we're looking to preserve and protect.
Okay, great, thank you. There is another question from Australia, and the question is, how do different definitions of online terrorism and violent extremism impact the effectiveness of government and industry responses? Do we need a single definition?
Well, that's a can of worms. I think, let me just think about that for a moment. There are very many different definitions. I don't know whether Erin shared with you their tool for they have an interactive map where you can look at different countries' definitions of terrorism, and the different elements that they do or don't contain. And that's a fascinating tool to look at it. I use it quite often myself in my day-to-day work. The GIF-CT, for their purposes in their incident response framework, they get around it because often, setting aside the difference of questions of differences of definitions of terrorism, it may be really unclear in the moments following attack what the motive was. And so they get around that by their criteria just being a terrorist or mass violence event with content produced by the perpetrator or an accomplice. So that or mass violence thing means that they can act without being 100% sure that it meets that it's a terrorist act, and without having to get too bound up in whoever's definition of terrorism it is. I suspect they work off the US one most. For the purposes of hash sharing, they actually have a taxonomy of what they'll include in the hash sharing database or not, and it doesn't rely on a particular definition of terrorism. Rather, it on the one hand, they'll include stuff that comes from a UN designated terrorist entity. On the other hand, they'll include material that has been the subject of a content incident as well. So they're working around that issue. For us, we have to be really cognizant of the fact that there can be misuse of the terrorist designation for political ends or to silence dissidents and the like. But in practice, it hasn't been an issue for us as yet. The cases that we've looked at have been pretty clear cut. The one I'd say where that hasn't been the case actually was the Memphis one, and it wasn't because of a lack of clarity or differing definitions of terrorism. It was more that it was a nihilist kind of motivation. And so even though it was the subject of a content incident for the GIF-CT, there are differing opinions across civil society and researchers about whether nihilism should be included in the kind of violent extremist terrorist category of content.
Yeah, the thorny issue of definitions. I thought someone would bring that up tonight. So sadly, it's not one that's been solved by the United Nations in the last 80 years. So I don't think we're going to solve it this evening.
No, indeed.
Just a quick question around the impact of potentially pending law changes in the US that are going through the courts at the moment. You know, this is Section 230 of the Communications Act, were around social media companies and the responsibility for hosting violent content online. What impact do you see this having on the Call's work?
Oh, well, potentially far-reaching, but I think I'll reserve judgment until we see what the outcome of the Supreme Court case is. It's pretty hard, I think. Yeah, pretty hard to say exactly where that will go.
Yeah, okay. No, fair enough. Thanks, Kristina. I have another question here. One of the issues you spoke about in your presentation was where you're going. You spoke about future technology, and I know before we came online with everyone, we had a brief chat about ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence platforms that are being used at the moment. We're really interested in the Call's kind of work around artificial intelligence and what you're doing in that space and where you see things going there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm sorry, I'm not particularly well placed to answer it because this isn't an area that I work on. Um, we do have a work stream that's just getting underway on the future and emerging tech, and that involves really in thinking about what the what emerging technologies there are, what future technologies there may be, what the particular areas of risk may be, and how we might get ahead of those. That working group has met once so far, so they're by no means well advanced in their work, but yeah, not totally in my wheelhouse, I'm afraid. Um, what are your what kinds of things are you seeing?
Well, I guess Stefan gave a really interesting presentation a couple of weeks back, the use of things like ChatGPT for generating narratives, violent extremism. Yeah, and I'd be really interested. Yeah, I guess not being in your wheelhouse, it's probably not something you're able to talk about, but I guess I would be interested down track to see where the call goes with work like this. So yeah. One of the things that the call brings to attention is really the paucity of research and progress in mapping and understanding online extremism. And although this is improving and getting better, there is still a lack in that area. At the same time, though, there have been criticisms of the call being or lacking transparency in many of the things that it does, which is restricting the ability to undertake good research. I just wonder if the call has a plan to kind of reconcile this and to perhaps reach out more in terms of transparency.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things about the call is that initially there was a reasonably small team working on it in the New Zealand end. We, as the team has grown, we have had more resources for that sort of outward facing transparency around what the call is, what we're working on, and how people can get involved. And it's actually a really important part of our community building piece as well, right? Because if nobody knows what we're doing, then they're not going to be able to get involved in the areas that are of interest to them. So increasing transparency around the call itself is definitely something that was identified in the second anniversary work plan, and something that we are continuing to drive towards. We had a new website last year, which was step one, and we're looking to continue improving in that space. In terms of research to plug into that, I guess that we have, there are a lot of researchers that are involved in the call work in their personal capacities or professionally through the advisory network. But there could be scope, I guess, for others to participate in particular working groups where they have a particular interest. And so, yeah, I completely take your point that if we get more information out there about what we're doing, then we can really grow the group of experts that we can draw from.
Yeah, no, that's great. It doesn't look like there are any more questions, Kristina, so you're off the hook a little early. But I just would like to say thanks to all of those people that have attended this evening and for your questions. But a big thanks to you, Kristina, both for the work that you and the Christchurch Call are doing around the place, of really important work and the really good work, I think, to make the online environment a better place. But also big thanks to you for a really excellent presentation this evening that's crossed a whole host of topics and fielded some thorny questions as well. It's been a fascinating a fascinating talk, and yeah, thank you very much for your time. It's been a real pleasure having you here.
Thank you. Yeah, glad we could finally do it.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to all of you for attending. Thanks.